Today I want to spend some time talking to you about the elements of a good lit review. And so to do that, I'll use an example from a published lit review, and we'll just walk through some of the different elements that you can expect to see and talk a little bit about how you would go around the beginning stages of developing your own lit review. So first of all, most lit reviews start with a problem in mind. So oftentimes we just think about general topics that we're interested in, and that's fine as a start, but at some point you want to think about, well, what problem are you trying to solve, or what piece of information are you trying to add more knowledge to, or what group are you trying to help. So in the sample that we're going to look at, the problem in mind is high teacher turnover. So in the issue of high teacher turnover, there are lots of different ways that you could approach that particular problem. In this particular journal, they begin by asking a question, which is, what strategies promote the recruitment and retention of teachers? And as a research question, it's very clear and helps us get started thinking about how we're going to gather both literature and data to help us answer this question. So they're focusing on strategies. They're not looking at specific perceptions. They're looking at actual things that administrators could do or have done in the past along two lines. One, to recruit teachers, and the other is to retain them. So it's clear, it's to the point, and from that we start to develop sub-questions that we can actually turn into research questions. So here they list 4 sub-questions, and in each case you want to be careful that you haven't picked questions that are so broad that they're really impossible to answer with a discrete project, or so specific or so discrete that they don't really lend themselves to answering the question fully enough to be of any worth to anybody. So as you look at these 4 main sub-questions that I've put up on the screen, each of these sub-questions meet that criteria. You look at number 1, for example. What are the characteristics of individuals who enter the teaching profession? So by asking that question, you're starting to lay the groundwork for the population that you're working with. And as you lay that groundwork, that becomes important for answering the subsequent questions. If you don't know what students become teachers, and then try to understand what are the characteristics of those teachers who stay, then it becomes much more difficult to say with any certainty that the strategies that you're employing are going to be effective for the population that you're working with. In all cases, context matters, and so you're going to at some point have to define what context you're referring to when you're looking at your research. Maybe what you're looking at only applies to rural schools, and surely with school retention we can make the case that rural schools and urban schools experience teacher and administrative shortages differently. And so understanding that up front for the reader is going to be really important for how they interpret what it is that you find. So once you've done that, you want to have a really firm understanding of what your goals are as a researcher. So in this article that we're using as an example, they actually do a nice job of identifying up front. Here are the 2 main goals. They do this for the reader early on in the paper. One is to review the research in a comprehensive way, and in a way that's relevant and up to date. And what they're talking about there is providing a strong coverage of what the literature has to say, so that people can build on that literature in future research and in their practice. But the second point is often ignored and perhaps more important, and that is providing a guide to the merit and importance of these studies. And when we talk about merit, we're not just talking about whether it's applicable to the context, as I mentioned earlier, but also if the research itself is sound. So you're going to have to think about the methodology they used and try to lend a critical eye to whether the findings that the author are saying that they're providing actually fit with the data they collected, the analysis that they employed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of a lit review. you're going to see these introductory elements that we just covered. And then beyond that, you're going to see the following four sections. One is a conceptual framework. And we'll talk a little bit more about conceptual framework in class. I have a very nice help document that'll be available to you on the website. But generally speaking, a conceptual framework helps the reader and you, the author, understand what is the prior research and what is the prior theory that you're building upon that helps you think that the work that you're doing might have a reasonable answer to the question that you're asking. And so, again, we'll talk about that in more detail, but it's a way to synthesize and bring together theories, sometimes from very different fields, and help the reader understand how you're using that to guide your own research. Methodology, and we don't often think about methodology as a section for a lit review, but it is important to let the reader understand how you selected and evaluated research. For example, oftentimes we have students who are interested in doing a lit review on a technology topic. Well, one of the parameters that you would use when you're searching the literature for technology would be time. Now, you're always going to think about timeliness of an article, but for technology particularly, because an article that was written 8 years ago might not be relevant at all to the technology you're studying today. So we'll talk about methodology, and you'll also talk about not just timeliness, but what are the other elements of an article you're looking for inclusion in your literature review. One of those elements is going to be some description of rigor. So there's going to be some sense of how rigorous the empirical work was, and that in itself, the empirical nature of the article will also be a criteria for selection. And what we mean by that is that there are lots of different kinds of articles that you can look at. You'll have theoretical articles, you'll have opinion pieces, case studies. Are you only looking at those that show up in peer-reviewed journals, meaning academic journals that have gone through a blind peer review process? Are you including theoretical pieces, and if so, what's your criteria for including them? Third is the review of the literature itself, and obviously this is the largest part. It makes sense to structure a review of the literature around the research questions, meaning those sub-questions that you created from your main topic question. So essentially you're using the literature to answer each of those questions in order. And then finally, your summary, conclusions, and suggestions for future research. So in this piece, you're bringing it all together and you're providing a so what description to what you found in the literature. In other words, you're answering the questions that you've asked to the best of your knowledge in literature. And you're also setting the table for what will come next, which in most cases is going to be either further research, so you're setting the table for your methodology. And when you're doing that, what I mean by setting the table is you're identifying what are the weaknesses in the existing literature and what are the areas that you think you can make a significant contribution to. The weaknesses can involve the samples that were used. It can involve context, meaning that the literature is dominated by, say, urban school research, where rural school research would be a strong addition to the field. Or it could simply be that the quality of the work in that particular field is lacking. Or, so that's the research piece, or it could be setting the table for practice, in which case you would talk about how does what you've learned here impact practitioners in the field, how can they use what you've reported in your literature review to improve the lives of students, or to, in this case, to more effectively recruit and retain teachers. So that's a brief description of what a lit review looks like, some of the main components. Each of those components we'll spend some time talking about in a little bit more detail as the course progresses. So I encourage you to read the sample that I've provided, and all what we talked about today comes from the sample that's available on the main website, and to get familiar with these lit reviews look like, and then as you dig in to literature, find lit reviews that are based on your specific topic.